Ade,
Stephanie,
Leslie,
Michaela,
Dylan,
and all of us are the Learnalots.
Hello, Learnalots. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Great to see you. You know, the other day, I was reading about Bermuda's forts, and I read about a fort that I'd never heard of before. It's called Newton's Bay Fort. It's on the South Shore. Now, back in the 1700s and 1800s, the forts were used as part of Bermuda's defense system. Why don't we put some information in our
Supercharged Super Screen
and find out some more about Bermuda's forts.
Welcome, Learnalots. As another Bermudian, I'm very pleased that you are interested in our historic forts. So let's go and join Lance Ferbert and have a look at some of these very interesting sites.
Our first stop was to Alexandra Battery next to Builders Bay in St. George's, where we met Dr. Harris and Mr. Lance Ferbert, who is the curator of forts for the Bermuda Parks Department. They took us on our tour of the battery and told us some interesting stories. We all wanted Dr. Harris to show us the book on forts he's written. There's so much information and lots of great pictures and stories. We read about some of the forts that we are going to visit.
Why is this called Alexandra Battery? What is a battery?
Well, the battery, the name Alexandra, comes from a princess. It was named after Princess Alexandra. A battery is really just another name for a fort. But I suspect that most of the forts that are like this, that are open forts rather than enclosed castles like Fortson Catherine, those are the ones that generally are called batteries.
How many guns and cannons were there at this fort?
In the earlier fort, in the 1860s, there were 5 guns around the bottom of this mound that we're sitting on. And they were all like the 9-inch gun that we saw earlier with the great iron battery shields in front of them. In later years, in the 1900s, there were 2 6-inch guns. Back here, they had one huge gun here and one over on the other side. And in fact, we have a really nice picture of one of these guns with a man by the name of Major Bird sitting on it. And you can see that picture in Dr. Harris's book.
Why did they need that many guns?
The thing that we were protecting was the channel just out here, the channel where the boats had to come between those buoys we see going by the fort here. Now, in the early days, in the 1800s, you will remember that I said that there were 5 guns here. Well, we needed 5 guns in those days because the guns were not that accurate, and so you needed a lot of guns to make sure you laid down a heavy field of fire and to make sure that one of those guns would be able to sink that ship. In later years, in the 1900s, there were only 2 guns because the guns were a lot more accurate and they had a lot longer range, and so they would possibly hit the ship before it got in close, and they had a lot longer time to aim and to make sure that they could get a target on the ship and get it down.
Mr. Ferbert pointed out to us the most important part of this whole area. We all went down to take a closer look.
This area is called Frobisher's Buildings Bay. It's one of the most important areas in Bermuda's early history. When the Sea Venture castaways landed on Gates Bay next to Fortson Catherine, they spent a few days there, and they eventually decided that there was not going to be a rescue ship from Virginia to take them on to Virginia, and so they came around here, and in this little bay right here, they set up the scaffolding to build a ship. The ship they built was the Deliverance, and most of you have probably seen the Deliverance in St. George's, the replica on Ordnance Island. That was built right here, in this little bay here. And so they were here for 10 months building this ship. There are many firsts in this area, many firsts for Bermuda. In fact, the first wedding that took place in Bermuda took place here in this area someplace. The first trial in Bermuda took place here. The first execution took place here. And the first birth. So I think that's particularly interesting that there were 2 babies born here. One was named Bermudas, There was a little girl, and a little boy, I'm sorry, and a little girl named Bermuda. And in fact, Bermuda's father was John Rolfe. And John Rolfe eventually went to Virginia and married Pocahontas. Most of you know about Pocahontas, the show Pocahontas. Well, her husband was here for 10 months.
We have a lot more forts to visit. We better get rolling.
Our next stop is the most well-known fort of all, Fort St. Catherine.
Good morning, Learnalots.
Good morning.
Welcome to Fortson Catherine.
Thank you.
You're welcome. On your step.
We heard there was a ghost called George who lives in the fort, and we wondered whether we'd see him. There's a lot to see here. Wow, this place is really wicked. No sign of the ghost still. Oh man, I guess we were wrong. We'd better march on out of here before he appears again.
Who's down here disturbing my rest? Oh, sirs, the Learnalots. Let me show you the way here through the maze of the fort. Follow me.
Phew, I guess there isn't any ghost after all. Even so, we were happy to be shown the way out. We met with Mr. Ferbert again to ask him some questions. When was this fort built?
The first fort on this site was built in 1614, and then there was building in the 1790s, and then in the early 1800s, and the building that we're looking at today was built between 1865 and 1878. The fort was actually used right up until World War II.
Why did they name it Fort St. Catherine?
St. Catherine was the patron saint of wheelwrights and carpenters, and Bermuda's first governor was a carpenter, and so some believe that the reason why he named it Fort St. Catherine is because he was a carpenter, and he would have named it after his patron saint. However, we have noticed in recent times that this point was also called St. Catherine's Point before the fort was here, so that's something we're still researching to find out exactly where the name came from.
Why did they build forts in Bermuda?
As you know, the Spanish discovered Bermuda, and when the British settlers arrived and colonized the island in 1612, they were told before they left England that the first thing they needed to do when they got to Bermuda was to fortify the island in case the Spanish came to try and take it back. In later years, they had to defend against the French, and by the time you got to this fort, they were defending the dockyard mainly from the Americans.
Why is this fort so important?
Fort St. Catherine was the first in a line of forts which stretched from this point, St. Catherine's Point, out to Paget Island. And the reason why the fort was placed here is because the king's ships would be docked just around the corner here, and they could come up and form a line and stop any ship that would be coming down this channel and trying to get to the dockyard.
Did you know there are about 90 forts in Bermuda?
This gun is a 10-inch RML. It weighs 18 tons, and it fired a projectile of 400 pounds. These guns are very rare in the world, but we're very fortunate in Bermuda in that we have 15 of these guns. And in fact, Woolwich Arsenal, the place where the gun was made, contacted us just the other day to see if we could send one of our guns over to them for exhibit.
This is a great place to visit to find out about Bermuda's early history. But it's time to move on now.
To continue our adventure, we took a boat ride to Paget Island near St. George's to visit two very old forts, Paget Fort and Fort Cunningham. It was a bit of a hike to our first spot, but it was worth it. When was this fort built?
This fort was the first fort built in Bermuda. It was built in 1612 by Governor Moore. When Governor Moore came to Bermuda in 1612, he first spent a few days on that island right over there. It's called Smith's Island, and then they went into St. George's and built themselves some shelter. And then the very next thing they did was to come out here and build this first fort, which was called Paget Fort.
Why are they digging here?
This is an archaeological dig that's being done by Dr. Edward Harris from the Bermuda Maritime Museum and Brown University. And what they're doing here, you see all the little bits and pieces here, they're recovering the walls of the old fort. So we'll see exactly what the fort looked like in the 1600s and the early 1700s.
What was this fort used for?
Okay, this fort was to defend this little channel that goes right through here. This was the original channel into St. George's Harbor. Before the town cut was built, all the ships that went into St. George's had to come through here. And this fort worked with that fort over there on the other island. You see the building over there? That was called Smith's Fort. And any ship that came through here had to pass between the guns of this fort and that fort over there. And if they didn't identify themselves or they were considered a ship that Bermuda didn't want, these forts were responsible for keeping them from going in. Now, once they got in there and they did their business and they had to come back out, they had to have a letter for the man who was in charge of this fort. And if they didn't have that letter sent out, the forts wouldn't let them come through. The guns would be trained here and they would fire on them before they went out. Now, it wasn't always easy to get into this harbor. And if you look over there, you see the little white pole right below Smith's Fort there. That was called a warping pole. So when you were having trouble getting in, you'd put a man in a rowboat, he'd go out there, and you'd put a rope on that, and they'd be able to pull themselves through. And those little poles went all the way down. Another interesting thing about this harbor is that at one time this harbor was chained. A man by the name of Sir Robert Robinson made a chain that went right across this harbor, and if he wanted to keep a ship out or maybe keep a ship from coming out, he could raise that chain and of course stop the ship. The ship would sail up and hit the chain and stop. This was important because the first people who came here, the first settlers who came here, sailed into this harbor. Now you might remember that Matthew Somers, Sir George Somers' nephew, when Sir George Somers died, they left 3 men on the island. Those 3 men lived over there. There were 3 guys lived right over on Smith's Island. They had a dog with them. And when the settlers came in 1612, they sailed through here. They sailed up here and they went over on that island. And the first thing they did was to have a little prayer meeting, thank the Lord that they had arrived safely. And while they were praying, these guys came, the 3 men that were on the island came and met them. So they spent a few days there on the island. Governor Moore did with his people. Then they went into St. George's, built some shelters, and then they came out and started building these forts. Now, one of the men that were on this island was Mr. Carter. You had Waters and Chard and Mr. Carter. Now, these 3 men were here for 2 years, and while they were here, they discovered some ambergris. Ambergris was extremely valuable, and they were trying to figure a way to get this ambergris back to England, so of course they could become rich men. And while they were here trying to do that, they decided they would build a boat and sail up to Newfoundland. While they were making these plans, of course, the settlers came, and then they tried to have a little conspiracy with the man who was the captain of the ship to get this ambergris off the island. And Mr. Carter was the one who went and told the governor what was going on. And as a reward for telling the governor about the conspiracy, Mr. Carter was off at this island right over here. Big island here where the lighthouse is, which is called St. David's Island. But he decided instead of St. David's, he would take Cooper's Island, which is just over the hill, you know, where the NASA station is, and that sort of way. And the reason why he wanted to take Cooper's Island is because he believed that there was treasure on that island. And he spent quite a bit of time digging that island up. And the interesting thing to me about Mr. Carter's time on Cooper's Island is that he had an animal to protect the island. You'd never guess what it was, but it was a ram, a sheep, a male sheep. It was like he had an attack sheep, and anybody that came to that island, that sheep was so vicious he'd run out, and in fact, it said in some cases he'd run into the water to get somebody that was coming to the island.
You know who it is, kids. It's me, Professor Irvin Mervin Nutty. Okay, today we're going to do a crazy exciting experiment to do with air pressure. We're going to make our very own fountain, okay? Now, what we have here, you want to get yourself 2 glass jars. Fill one with, I've got food coloring because it's beautiful, okay? You're going to fill 1 glass jar up to the top. You're going to fill the other one just a little bit, okay? Now, you get the top of one of the jars. You want your folks to poke 2 holes in one of the lids. You're going to get 3 straws. You're going to make 1 big long straw out of 2. You're going to get another straw, put it right through the middle here, as you can see. Now, 1 straw has to be further through the lid than the other one. I'll explain this in a second, okay? This straw has to be much more further down than the big long one, okay? So, get yourself some Play-Doh. Seal up the holes around the straw in the lid. You want to make it airtight or tight so nothing can escape. Make the seals, okay? Here we go. I'm going to attach this here, okay? Get your books and a bowl. Now you want to set the big one that's full on top of the books, and we are going to roll with this experiment. Are you ready? Okay. Now you see that? Excellent. Now, the air pressure, this is working because the air pressure in this is greater than the air pressure in the other jar, thus forcing the water down and up through the straw as the water goes into the bowl. All right? One more exciting experiment from yours truly, well, Professor Irvin Mervin Nutty, and I'll see you kids next time on the Learnalots.
On the other side of the island, we found Fort Cunningham, which was built in the shape of a pentagon and had a large drawbridge at the entrance. We were anxious to explore the area and to ask Mr. Ferbert some questions about it. Most of us had never been here before.
What makes this fort so important?
Okay, this fort is called Fort Cunningham. It's probably the most important fort in the St. George's area. At one stage, the command post for all the forts in this area was on top of Fort Cunningham here. And Fort Cunningham was used to protect channel, the entrance to the channel that goes around the island. Any ship that came into Bermuda had to come into 5 Fathom Hole, and with these huge guns, these 2 12.5s and the 5 10-inch guns over there, they would be able to stop any ship that would be trying to come into Bermuda to attack the dockyard at the western end.
Can you tell us a little bit more about why these guns are so important?
Okay, the really important guns out of the 7 guns here are these 2, which are 12.5 guns. They weigh 38 tons. They fired a projectile of about 800 pounds. They were the largest muzzle-loading guns sent by the British to this side of the world. In fact, there were only 2 of these guns sent over here, and both of them are here at Fort Cunningham.
Did you know that Fort Cunningham was the only flat-fronted British fort in the world?
Because this fort was made out of steel nickel plate, it was very expensive indeed. And in fact, the opposition in Britain at the time asked the government whether this fort was being made out of gold. The fort itself, the front of the fort, is made of 3 sheets of steel nickel plate, 5-inch thick sheets. So you have 5 inches of steel nickel plate, 1 inch of teak, another 5 inches of steel nickel plate, 1 inch of teak, and then another 5 inches. And then behind that, there's another 12 inches of alternate teak and steel nickel plate. So that made this fort a very, very strong fort indeed.
Archaeologists have been doing a lot of digging on this island, and we met Paul Nasca from the Maritime Museum, who is working on preserving some of the artifacts that they've found.
What I'm working on is a large deposit of buttons that was excavated in 1997 from Paget Fort on Paget's Island, and it represents the largest deposit of buttons yet recovered here in Bermuda. These buttons are unique because each of them contains the regimental number of the soldiers, which group the soldiers belong to. And in order to decipher that number off of each of the buttons, we need to clean them first, and that's what I'm doing here. Very slowly, looking through a microscope to be sure to only remove the sand and the corrosion that has built up on them while not damaging the button. Also, the soldiers at Paget Fort made their own buttons, like these examples here that were recovered from Commissioner's House.
Traveling around our beautiful island, we sometimes come across areas that need attention. We are here at the railway trail near Whale Bay in Southampton. And what a sight it is. Bottles, plastic, and bags of trash just carelessly thrown away. This is disgusting. It really doesn't take much to dispose of these things properly. Please use the trash bins. Do not litter. Keep our environment clean. For the Learnalots program, this is Tony Trash reporting.
Our final stop was to St. David's Battery, where we were anxious to hear more stories from Mr. Ferbert.
Why is this fort different from the other forts?
St. David's Battery is a little different from some of the other forts we've looked at because it's a little newer. It was built in 1910. And the interesting thing about St. David's Battery is that it was built by Bermudian laborers. Now, most of the others were built by British soldiers and engineers and those kinds of people, but this fort was built by Bermudians, and then it was manned by Bermudians. You had the Bermuda Militia Artillery here, which was the Black Regiment, and then the BVEs, the Bermuda Volunteer Engineers, were the men who ran the lights here. There was also, in later years, the BMIs, the Bermuda Militia Infantry, that was here. So most of us, most Bermudians have some relative that were stationed at this fort at some time.
Can you tell us about these big guns?
These guns were called 9.2s. They were the biggest guns brought to Bermuda. There were only a couple of them, in fact, and there were 2 of them here. They had a range of about 9 miles, so they were very effective. And one of the things that the people in this area learned about these guns is that when they fired them, they were so loud that people in the neighborhood would come up to the commanding officer and complain about the fact that their windows were shattered or maybe their tank was cracked. And so for that reason, these guns were seldom fired. Now, the other guns here were the most interesting guns, I think, to us as Bermudians, the 6-inch guns, which are down the other end of the battery. And those are the guns that were fired by the Bermudian soldiers, by the BMA. And in fact, my father was a gunner on one of the guns at the other end of the battery.
We wanted to go over to see the 6-inch guns that he was telling us about.
Did they ever have to use these guns?
These guns were actually used fairly often because this battery, the 6-inch battery, which includes this gun and the one next to it, were the examination battery for Bermuda. And what that meant is that every ship that came into Bermuda that had to come into this channel here at 5 Fathom Hole was examined by this battery. Now at night, there were huge spotlights on the bottom of this hill, electric light emplacements they were called. And those lights would shine out in where we see the buoys out there, would shine out there, and the ship was then required to identify itself. And these guns were trained on it until it was clear that the ship was a friendly ship as opposed to being an enemy ship. If the ship didn't identify itself, then these guns would be used to stop it. In other words, to fire on the ship and try to put a hole on it and sink it.
We learned that another important fort is located nearby on Castle Island.
Has anybody here been to Castle Island?
No.
Okay, Castle Island is an island at the entrance to Castle Harbor. And on Castle Island is the oldest standing fort in Bermuda. It was built, it's called King's Castle, and it was built in 1612. Not only is it the oldest standing fort in Bermuda, it's the oldest standing British fort in the New World. And behind it is the Captain's House, which is the oldest standing house, British house in the New World. So we have both the oldest standing fort and the oldest standing house in the New World out at Castle Harbor.
Was King Castle ever used?
Yes, in fact, King's Castle is one of only 2 places that I know of where a shot was fired in anger from Bermuda. In 1614, the Spanish actually sailed near Castle Harbor, the entrance of Castle Harbor. Now, we know that the Spanish discovered Bermuda, and it was always thought that they would come back and try to take Bermuda. Well, in 1614, they sent 2 ships to Bermuda just to see whether or not the English had fortified. And they sailed up down the South Shore, and then they sailed up to the mouth of Castle Harbor, and 2 shots were fired at them. The first shot, probably a ranging shot. The second shot, the British think, went through the Spanish sail. And with that, they turned around and sailed away. Now, what the Spanish didn't know was there were only 3 shots in the fort. That's all they had, was 3 shots. So they had shot 2 of their 3 shots. And when they shot that second shot, they knocked over the barrel of gunpowder, which was below the muzzle of the gun. So they were virtually defenseless. So if the Spanish had kept sailing in, they probably would have captured the fort, and we'd all be speaking Spanish now.
Can you tell us about some of the other forts in Bermuda?
We've only visited a few forts in St. George's, but there are many other important forts in St. George's and on the rest of the island. The most important forts were built in the 1800s, and some of the ones that we didn't visit were Fort William, Fort Victoria, which is up at the hill where Club Med is, Little Gates Fort down on the town cut, and the forts at Ferry Reach, the Martello Tower, and there are two other forts there as well. And up on the main island, we had the three forts in Hamilton. Fort Hamilton is left of those three. You can go up and visit that. There's Whale Bay Fort, there's Fort Scar, and then there's the Dockyard, which was the largest fort in Bermuda. And all these forts from the 1800s, the large forts that we visit, like St. David's Battery and some of the other ones that we visited and the ones that I've mentioned, were all built to protect the Royal Naval Dockyard.
We asked Dr. Harris to tell us a little bit more about the importance of the dockyard. He started by telling us about the Commissioner's house.
The Commissioner's house was the place where the Commissioner who ran the dockyard lived with his family and children. And the dockyard was the place where the Royal Navy could repair its ships so that it could keep them afloat and working in time of war and also in time of peace or emergencies. The big building in the dockyard with the two towers was the main office for the Commissioner. That's where he issued all the orders to repair the ships. And behind it, the very large building used to be our prison. That was called Casemate Barracks originally, and that's where the soldiers who manned all of the guns around the fortifications of the dockyard lived. They were called the Royal Marine Light Infantry, and they were Royal Marines rather than other types of soldiers because they came with the ships. The Royal Marines were the soldiers on the ships. The dockyard was used from about 1820 right up until the end of the Second World War.
I never knew there were so many interesting forts and places in Bermuda.
Yeah, there are quite a number of interesting places in Bermuda, and I think we all should, as Bermudians, pay attention and go out and explore our own island, because there's probably more historical sites in Bermuda per square mile than any other place in the world. And in fact, the forts that we've been looking at and the town of St. George have been nominated as World Heritage Sites. And so in the future, the whole world will recognize the wonderful historical and cultural entities we have in Bermuda.
Well, that's it for our show on forts. Come on, everyone. Get out there and explore Bermuda.
Ahoy, mateys! Watch our next show on shipwrecks. Coming in July. You'll love it.